Anytime you do a extensive amount of time, it can have two effects. It can harden you, or it can make you think.
November 1973, Larry Hoover was sentenced to 200 years for murder. Authorities believed his empire was finally finished. Instead, Larry managed to build an army of thousands, flooding the streets with drugs and millions in profit, all from his cell. These are 10 of the most feared drug lords in prison.
There's thousands and thousands of low-level members in prisons. There's these millionaire drug traffickers who are flying around the world. There's this brilliant genius figure of Marcola.
May 2006, violence erupted across the city of São Paulo. Police stations are attacked, buses are set on fire, and the streets are paralyzed with sheer fear. By the end, more than 150 people are dead. Behind it all is a man sitting in a prison cell, quietly giving orders. His name is Marcos Williams Herbas Camacho, better known as Marcola. And this wasn't even the first time Marcola showed his reach. And it wasn't the last. 1968, Marcola was born to a poor family in Brazil, with a Bolivian father and a Brazilian mother. By the age of 9, he was already stealing, and by 35, he had spent half his life in prison. But prison didn't just confine him, it transformed him. Locked away, Marcola turned to books. He claims to have read more than 3,000 of them, everything from Dante to Nietzsche to Victor Hugo. Over the years, he became more than a street thief. He became a thinker, a strategist, sharpening his mind while quietly plotting his next moves. And right inside the chaos of Brazil's overcrowded prisons, Marcola found his perfect stage. He climbed to the top of the Primeiro Comando da Capital, or PCC, meaning the First Capital Command.
The PCC is the strongest, most sophisticated, and most dangerous criminal organization you haven't heard of.
Under Marcola's watch, the group stopped being just another prison gang, and it grew into a powerful criminal network. He gave it structure by writing rules, enforcing a strict code of conduct, and demanding loyalty in the form of monthly dues. Members called it the Devil's Code, and breaking it usually meant one thing: death. What made him feared wasn't just the drugs or the money, it was his ability to control life on the streets from a cell. He once said it simply in an interview: "It's you who are afraid of dying, not me. As a matter of fact, here in jail you can't come in and kill me, but I can order to kill you out there." And here's the thing. The PCC didn't just run Brazil's prisons, it expanded outward, controlling cocaine routes across South America, forging alliances with mafias in Europe, and flooding international markets with billions of dollars worth of drugs. Prosecutors estimate the group now makes around $1 billion a year. And every so often, Marcola liked to remind the country of his power. 2001, Marcola orchestrated a wave of 29 prison riots across São Paulo. Then in 2006, his orders unleashed one of the deadliest uprisings the city had ever seen, paralyzing Brazil's largest city and leaving police scrambling to understand what hit them. From that point on, no one felt safe. Judges, officers, even ordinary civilians knew they could be targets of his men. Today, Marcola is serving a 342-year sentence in Brazil's toughest federal prison, built specifically to isolate the country's most dangerous inmates. But even there, he still has a lot of power. Authorities have uncovered plots to rescue him with helicopters, mercenaries, and even anti-aircraft weapons. Prosecutors who challenge him live under constant protection. Some even compare their lives to anti-mafia crusaders in Italy, always looking over their shoulder, always wondering if they'll be next.
Authorities in Colombia say they've captured the country's most wanted drug trafficker. The feared leader of a major drug cartel, Dato Antonio Usuga, had been on the run for more than a decade.
August 8, 2023, in a Brooklyn courtroom, a federal judge delivers the words everyone has been waiting for: 45 years in prison, plus a $216 million fine. At the defense table, Dato Antonio Usuga, better known as Otoniel, apologizes for his actions. But his words can't erase the past. For so many years, those actions had spilled innocent blood and forced entire towns to bolt their doors in fear. So, who is this man, and how did he end up here? 1971. Otoniel was born in a small town called Necoclí in Colombia's northwest. His family was poor, struggling to make ends meet. At 18, he joined a guerrilla group, not because he believed in the cause, but because, as his mother once said, that's all there was. And when the group laid down its arms 2 years later after signing a peace treaty, Otoniel didn't go back to farming. He stepped further into a world where power came from guns and money. By the mid-2000s, he found his true path: drug trafficking. Alongside his brother Giovanni, he rose through the ranks of a group that would become known as the Gulf Clan. When Giovanni was killed in a police raid in 2009, Otoniel assumed full control, and that's when his reputation exploded, so much so that U.S. officials later called him the most violent Colombian trafficker since Pablo Escobar. Under his rule, the Gulf Clan wasn't just a drug gang, it was an army. Thousands of men in military uniforms marched with rifles, patrolling whole regions of Colombia. Some were just boys, and Otoniel was notorious for breaking them down with cruelty to keep them in line. His network ran cocaine labs, taxed anyone moving drugs through their territory, and shipped massive loads of drugs north toward the United States. And if someone got in the way, whether it was a rival, a police officer, or just an ordinary civilian, the response was brutal. After his brother's death, Otoniel famously ordered a paro armado, a forced shutdown. Businesses closed, streets emptied, and entire towns went quiet. Those who disobeyed the order risked being killed. He even put bounties on police officers and silenced every witness who dared speak against him. And so, for over a decade, he was untouchable and lived freely as Colombia's most wanted man. 2015, things changed. Over 1,200 police officers were assigned to find him. The manhunt was a national obsession, with helicopters scanning the jungles and flyers raining down from the sky, promising money for any tips leading to him. Even the U.S. offered a $5 million reward. Eventually, Otoniel himself appeared in a shaky video online saying he wanted to surrender, but he never did. What finally broke his cover was something ordinary: medicine. Authorities managed to track couriers carrying drugs for his kidney disease, which led them to orchestrate a massive operation. October 2021, Colombian forces launched Operation Osiris. It was like a military movie with hundreds of troops, Navy ships blocking the coast, drones buzzing overhead, and helicopters circling the perimeters. And finally, they closed in on his hideout in the mountains near the Panamanian border on October 23rd. And just like that, it was over, and the man who had evaded justice for so long was finally in handcuffs. A year later, he was extradited to the U.S. In January 2023, he pleaded guilty, and in August, the judge gave him 45 years. Now he's just another inmate at ADX Florence, the Supermax prison in Colorado, built for the most dangerous men in the U.S. People who can't be trusted with anything less than total control. The Gulf Clan is still around, but without Otoniel's iron hand, its power isn't what it once was. For the families of police officers who died hunting him, and for the shopkeepers who once pulled down their shutters in fear, his capture was more than just a headline. It was a chance to finally breathe.
How did a Texas high school star become one of the most wanted men in the hemisphere, accused of being behind some of the horrible epidemic of murders across the Mexican border?
August 30th, 2010, cameras flashed in Mexico City as police dragged out a cartel boss with blonde hair and blue eyes, who was once known for flashy suits, mansions, and even a private zoo with a lion. He was known as La Barbie, a nickname that sounds harmless, almost playful. But for years, Edgar Valdez Villarreal was one of Mexico's most feared cartel leaders, a man whose rise was built on brutality and fear. 1973, Valdez wasn't born in Mexico. He grew up across the border in Laredo, Texas, where he was a high school linebacker. His coach gave him the nickname Barbie because of his looks. On the surface, he looked like an all-American athlete, but by his late teens, he was already speeding down the wrong road, literally. At 19, he was arrested after a reckless driving incident that ended in tragedy. He ran over a middle school counselor with his truck and was charged with criminally negligent homicide. But in the end, the charges didn't stick, and he walked free. Soon after, he began dealing marijuana on the streets of Laredo. By that time, he had turned down his father's offer to pay for college, choosing instead to chase fast money. And by his early 20s, he was facing indictments in the U.S. To evade capture, he fled south into Mexico. And that's where his life and his reputation changed forever. In Mexico, Valdez joined the Beltran Leyva cartel, which at the time was allied with El Chapo's powerful Sinaloa cartel. Thanks to his connections on both sides of the border, he quickly climbed through the ranks. Eventually, he took command of Los Negros, the cartel's armed enforcement wing. Their job was to protect smuggling routes and crush rivals like Los Zetas. But La Barbie wasn't just another trafficker. He became infamous for his brutal tactics, which included kidnappings, videotape torture, and public executions meant to send a message. Then, in 2009, when cartel boss Arturo Beltran Leyva was killed, Valdez made his move for power. The result was a bloody civil war inside the cartel. In cities like Cuernavaca and Acapulco, people woke up to corpses, sometimes decapitated, left dangling from bridges as warnings. The violence was relentless, and more than 150 deaths were tied to that conflict alone. Mexican authorities had been after La Barbie since the early 2000s. The U.S. also put a $2 million bounty on his head, but he always managed to slip through the cracks and dodge raids across 5 states, feeling just before police arrived. But on August 30th, 2010, the chase finally ended. Federal police stormed a vacation house near Mexico City and captured him without a fight. Then President Felipe Calderón called him one of the most wanted criminals in Mexico and abroad. 2015, La Barbie was extradited to the U.S. A year later, he pleaded guilty to trafficking cocaine into the country and laundering money back into Mexico. Prosecutors said he was importing a ton of cocaine a month, turning cities like Atlanta into distribution hubs. Despite his violent history, his family pleaded for leniency. In court, his sister Carla, a prosecutor in Texas, spoke about the values their parents raised them with. But the judge struggled to reconcile that image with the man before him. He asked,
"Why are you a prosecutor and your brother a seriously evil criminal?"
But it was a question even the family couldn't answer. In the end, the judge handed him a 49-year sentence, and today, Edgar Valdez Villarreal sits in a high-security federal prison in Florida. His flashy lifestyle replaced by bars, concrete walls, and decades to serve.
Estaba yo en una casa de Cosmos en Guadalajara cuando tumbaron la puerta sin ninguna orden de aprehensión, sin ninguna orden de presentación.
April 8, 1989. Police stormed a quiet home in Guadalajara, Mexico. Inside, they found Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo still in his bathrobe. For years, that man had been untouchable, protected by politicians, feared by rivals, and hailed as El Padrino, the godfather of Mexico's drug trade. But that morning, the illusion of safety was finally gone, and the boss of bosses was in handcuffs. 1946, Felix Gallardo was born on a ranch in Sinaloa and grew up in poverty. He worked hard, graduated from high school, and even studied business in college. He then joined the Federal Judicial Police and later worked as a bodyguard for the governor of Sinaloa. Those political ties opened many doors for him. And before long, he wasn't just guarding power, he was building it. By the late 1970s, he stepped fully into the drug trade, partnering with Rafael Caro Quintero and Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo. Together, they built the Guadalajara cartel, a cartel so dominant that it controlled nearly all drug trafficking in Mexico. By the early 1980s, the Colombians needed new routes into the U.S. after Florida became too risky. Mexico became the perfect gateway, and Felix Gallardo struck a deal with them. Instead of cash, his cartel would take half of every shipment. And just like that, Felix Gallardo was making money he could never spend in a lifetime. At its peak, his cartel was pulling in billions of dollars every year. One symbol of that wealth was Rancho Búfalo, a marijuana plantation so massive it looked like a small city. Spanning more than 1,000 hectares, It had thousands of workers tending the fields, all under the protection of corrupt officials. That plantation alone was valued at an estimated $8 billion. But money wasn't enough to keep everything quiet. DEA agent Enrique "Kiki" Camarena had been digging into the cartel's operations for years, and his intelligence eventually helped lead Mexican soldiers to discover and destroy Rancho Búfalo. February 9, 1985, Camarena was kidnapped, tortured for more than 30 hours, and killed in one of the most brutal crimes in DEA history. His body, alongside that of his pilot, was found buried in a shallow grave days later. The killing of an American agent was something no cartel boss could hide from. Operation Leyenda, the DEA's largest ever homicide investigation, was soon launched. And under intense pressure from the U.S., Mexican authorities had no choice but to arrest Caro Quintero and Fonseca. But Felix Gallardo, shielded by political connections, managed to remain free until that morning in 1989 when the law finally caught up with him. When he was finally captured, the fallout was massive. Dozens of police commanders were arrested, and nearly 90 officers deserted, exposing just how deep corruption ran. But even behind bars, Felix Gallardo still had influence. He famously ordered the cartel to be split into territories, handing plazas to men who would later become legends in their own right. The Arellano Felix brothers in Tijuana, the Carrillo Fuentes family in Juarez, and Joaquin El Chapo Guzman with Hector Palma in Sinaloa. And so, in many ways, his arrest planted the seeds of the violent cartel wars that would consume Mexico for decades. Felix Gallardo was sentenced to 40 years, later extended to 37 more. He spent years in maximum security before being moved to a medium security prison due to poor health. Today, in his late 70s, nearly blind and half deaf, he is serving what remains of his time under house arrest.
Salud es pésima. Mi familia está haciendo un hoyo para yo ser enterrado en un árbol.
But Felix Gallardo wasn't the only name tied to Kiki Camarena's murder. The next figure on our list was another feared drug lord whose role in the crime made him one of the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives.
Ya pagué mi culpa en lo que haya sido. ¿Quién no paga, por alta que sea, un delito? Sí, estuve casi 29 años.
July 15th, 2022, in Schwa, Sinaloa, a search dog named Max was sniffing the ground when he suddenly stopped. Moments later, Marines pulled a 69-year-old man out of the thick bushes, Rafael Caro Quintero. For nearly a decade, he had been the FBI's most wanted narco, known as the narco of narcos. Now he was back in handcuffs. Just hours after the operation, a Navy helicopter involved in the search crashed, killing 14 service members. It felt like a cruel reminder from the universe of how dangerous this man and the hunt for him had always been. You see, Caro Quintero wasn't just part of the Guadalajara cartel, he helped build it. By the late 1970s and early 80s, alongside Miguel Ángel Felix Gallardo and Ernesto Fonseca, he had turned Mexico into the key bridge for Colombian cocaine. But before that, it all began with marijuana fields, and Caro Quintero was usually the one running the massive operations. One of them was Rancho Búfalo, his pride and fortune. When it was destroyed thanks to agent Enrique Camarena's tip, the loss wasn't just financial. For Caro Quintero, it was personal. Most informants believed it was actually Caro Quintero who ordered agent Camarena's death. By then, he had earned a reputation as the most unhinged of the trio, especially after the loss of his ranch. January 1985, before even learning the tip had come from Camarena, Caro Quintero struck at two other Americans by mistake. Writer John Clay Walker and dentistry student Alberto Radelat had simply walked into the wrong restaurant. Convinced they were DEA agents, Caro Quintero ordered their murder. They weren't killed quickly. Both were tortured with ice picks. And then, Walker was beaten to death, while Radelat was wrapped in tablecloths and buried alive. A month later came Camarena's murder. He was tortured for over 30 hours and even injected with drugs to keep him awake to feel it all. He was then beaten until his ribs and skull were crushed and finally killed with a drill to the touchdown. That level of sadism, many say, came straight from Caro Quintero himself, even as Felix Gallardo reportedly warned him that killing an American agent was suicide. And it was. After the murder, Caro Quintero went on the run, but not for long. April 1985, Mexican authorities caught him in Costa Rica and sent him back to Mexico. He was sentenced to 40 years, but then came a twist. In 2013, a Mexican court released him on the technicality that he had been tried in a federal court for state crimes. But he wasn't so lucky. By the next day, new warrants were issued, and the US put him on the FBI 10 Most Wanted list, with a record $20 million reward. For the next 9 years, he was a ghost in the mountains of northern Mexico, until that search dog found him. But even that wasn't the end. February 27, 2025, Mexico finally extradited Caro Quintero to the United States as part of a mass handover. The next day in Brooklyn, he stood before a judge and pleaded not guilty to running a criminal enterprise and to charges tied to Camarena's murder. However this trial ends, the message from prosecutors was crystal clear. Justice may take time, but it always catches up.
The long road was paved with death, drugs, and destruction, but it ended today with justice.
January 19, 2017, in Brooklyn, New York, a federal judge looked across the courtroom at Joaquin Archibaldo Guzman Loera, better known as El Chapo, and handed down a life sentence. For decades, El Chapo had been the most infamous drug lord on earth, a man who ran the Sinaloa cartel with such brutality and cunning precision that his name was whispered like a curse. Now shackled and silent, he was bound for a supermax cell in Colorado, a place no one has ever escaped. But to understand how he ended up there, you need to know just how far he went to build his empire, and how many times he slipped through the cracks before finally, there were no cracks to slip through. 1957, El Chapo was born in the mountains of Sinaloa, Mexico, to a poor farming family. His childhood was rough, filled with abuse from his father and little hope of escaping poverty. By his teens, he was already helping his father grow opium poppies and marijuana.
Bueno, eso es una realidad que las drogas destruyen. Desgraciadamente, como le comento, por donde yo me crié, pues no había otra manera.
From there, he rose through the underworld, working first under Hector Palma and then Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo, the so-called godfather of the Guadalajara cartel. When Gallardo was arrested in 1989, Guzman seized the chance to build his own power base. And just like that, he helped turn the Sinaloa cartel into one of the biggest drug networks the world has ever seen. His methods were equal parts ruthless and methodical. The US authorities believe he was responsible for tens of thousands of deaths. Some estimates put the number as high as 35,000. And El Chapo didn't just kill rivals, he always made sure to turn them into examples. Some were dissolved in acid, others were burned to death, or even thrown alive into cages with wild animals. Torture wasn't just punishment in his world, it was theater, designed to keep fear alive. Yet, for all his brutality, what really made El Chapo legendary were his escapes. For years, it seemed no prison could hold him. Until now. 1993, his first big fall came when he was arrested in Guatemala and sentenced to 20 years in Mexico. Well, let's just say El Chapo never planned on serving the full term. January 19, 2001, with the help of corrupt guards, he was smuggled out of Puente Grande prison in a laundry cart. And for the next 13 years, he hid in the Sierra Madre Mountains, running his empire as if prison had never happened. 2014, things changed when authorities finally caught up with him. But the victory didn't last. A year later, in July 2015, El Chapo vanished again, this time through a mile-long tunnel dug right into the shower of his cell. At the far end, a motorcycle waited to take him to freedom. It was an escape so audacious it humiliated the Mexican government and made headlines worldwide. But his luck was really running out this time. In January 2016, Marines stormed a house in Los Mochis, Sinaloa, following a tip-off. And after a fierce shootout, they dragged him out of a sewer pipe. He was battered, cornered, but alive. Now, extradition has always been his worst fear, and in 2017, it came true. He was flown to New York to face charges ranging from drug trafficking and money laundering to ordering murders. 2 years later, a jury found him guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to life in prison, plus 30 years, and ordered to forfeit billions of dollars. Today, El Chapo is locked inside ADX Florence in Colorado, the most secure prison in the United States. Inmates there spend 23 hours a day in solitary confinement, with only an hour outside in a small concrete yard. Meals are passed through slots in the door. There are no tunnels, no motorcycles, and no luxuries. And so, for a man who once bribed guards, played volleyball, and even had women brought into his cell, the contrast couldn't be sharper. Not to mention that since ADX opened in 1994, no one has ever escaped. And for a man who built his myth on slipping through bars and vanishing into the mountains, this is where his story will end. And while El Chapo may have been the face of the Sinaloa cartel, he wasn't its only power. In the shadows, another man quietly ruled for decades. And unlike El Chapo, he had never spent a single day behind bars. Until now.
Will spend the rest of his life behind bars. He will die in a U.S. federal prison where he belongs.
July 25th, 2024. For the first time in his life, Ismael El Mayo Zambada found himself in handcuffs in El Paso, Texas. At 76 years old, the man who had spent decades as Mexico's most elusive cartel boss was finally in U.S. custody. Until that day, El Mayo had been a ghost. He was never once arrested, never once jailed, and he had managed to run the Sinaloa cartel from the shadows, while others like El Chapo grabbed the headlines. For years, people called him the last capo standing, until the day he finally fell. 1948, El Mayo was born in Sinaloa, Mexico, a poor farming state that has produced many of the country's most notorious drug lords. Unlike El Chapo, who craved the spotlight, El Mayo stayed quiet and careful. He built his power by being patient, discreet, and above all, loyal to the right people. We already know that when Felix Gallardo was arrested in 1989, Mexico's drug world fractured into pieces. One of those pieces became the Sinaloa cartel. And it wasn't just El Chapo holding the reins. You see, while El Chapo built his legend on daring escapes and a flashy empire, El Mayo was the strategist, the one who kept the machine running. By the 1990s, El Mayo controlled almost every route drugs could take. Airplanes, trucks, speedboats, even submarines, and underground tunnels. He used them all to move cocaine, heroin, meth, and later fentanyl into the United States. His network stretched from the coca fields of Colombia all the way to the streets of Chicago. And to make sure nothing got in his way, prosecutors say he kept a bribery budget of up to $1 million every month. Money that went straight into the pockets of police, soldiers, and politicians who looked the other way. But what made him so feared wasn't just the drugs. It was the violence that protected them. U.S. indictments described how El Mayo employed sicarios, cartel hitmen, who carried out murders, kidnappings, and torture at his command. During the cartel wars of the 1990s and 2000s, entire families were caught in the crossfire. And when El Chapo was locked away, it was El Mayo who kept the Sinaloa cartel growing by absorbing rivals, tightening control, and transforming it into a multi-billion-dollar empire. Even after El Chapo was captured in 2016, El Mayo kept pulling the strings. He acted as the mediator, balancing between El Chapo's sons, old allies, and splinter groups to stop the cartel from tearing itself apart. In Sinaloa, journalists described the atmosphere in those years with a single word: terror. But the most remarkable thing about El Mayo was how long he managed to stay free. While El Chapo was arrested 3 times and eventually sent to the U.S., El Mayo managed to hide for so many years in the Sierra Madre Mountains. Locals told stories of him living simply, always one step ahead of the military, moving through streams and rocky trails he knew like the back of his hand. He gave only one interview in 2010 to Proceso magazine, where he admitted he lived in constant fear of capture. He said,
"They'll only catch me if I get sloppy."
And eventually, he did. July 2024, El Mayo was lured to El Paso under pretenses and arrested alongside Joaquin Guzman Lopez, one of El Chapo's sons and a rising leader of the cartel. But for the man who had outlasted everyone, it was the end of an era. A year later, in August 2025, he stood in a Brooklyn courtroom and did something few expected, pleading guilty. He admitted to running a continuing criminal enterprise and apologized, saying he recognized the harm drugs had caused in Mexico and the United States. It was a stunning moment. After decades of silence, the most elusive drug kingpin alive was finally acknowledging his crimes. Today, El Mayo is no longer a ghost in the mountains. He's an old man in U.S. custody, waiting for the final sentence that will almost certainly keep him behind bars for the rest of his life.
Major bust in Mexico's war on drugs as Mexican authorities arrest the son of notorious drug kingpin Joaquin El Chapo Guzman.
The arrest of Ovidio Guzman sending shockwaves through the state of Sinaloa.
January 5th, 2023, just before dawn, military helicopters circled over the Jesus Maria district in Culiacan, Sinaloa, while convoys of armored trucks closed in. Their target was Ovidio Guzman Lopez, the 32-year-old son of El Chapo, known on the streets as El Raton or the Mouse. By the end of the operation, soldiers pulled him from a house and flew him straight to Mexico City. But the city he left behind looked like a war zone with burning cars, blocked highways, and bullets fired even at passenger planes. And this is exactly why Ovidio was feared. He wasn't just El Chapo's son, he was one of El Chapito, the faction of the Sinaloa cartel run by El Chapo's heirs. And when one of them is touched, the cartel shows how far it's willing to go. 1990, Ovidio grew up knowing exactly who his father was. By his late teens, he was already in the family business, helping traffic cocaine, cannabis, and later meth and fentanyl into the United States. The U.S. Treasury even blacklisted him in 2012 as a key lieutenant of his father. 2016, when El Chapo was captured for the last time, Ovidio and his brothers filled the gap. They weren't just keeping the cartel alive, they were expanding it, building massive meth labs across Sinaloa, some capable of producing thousands of pounds every month. And with fentanyl later added to the mix, the profits skyrocketed. But Ovidio also had a reputation for brutality, especially when cornered. October 2019, Mexican forces tried to arrest him in Culiacan. They succeeded at first, but then the cartel unleashed chaos in the city streets. Gunmen in armored trucks overran the city, broke prisoners out of jail, blocked roads with burning vehicles, and threatened to slaughter families of soldiers unless Ovidio was released. In the end, faced with the prospect of hundreds of civilian deaths, the government let him go. The second time, though, Mexico didn't back down. That was the 2023 raid. Nearly 3,500 troops were deployed, and the violence that followed left at least 30 people dead, including 10 soldiers. Once again, the cartel showed how much firepower it had, but this time Ovidio stayed in custody. By September, he was extradited to the United States. July 2025, standing in a Chicago courtroom, Ovidio Guzman Lopez pled guilty to federal charges of trafficking cocaine, meth, and marijuana, and to running a criminal enterprise. Facing the possibility of life in prison, reports suggest he may even cooperate with U.S. prosecutors to try to reduce his sentence. He had managed to slip through the cracks once, just like his father. But from this point on, the Mouse will almost certainly spend the next several decades in a cage.
They kids got a pen for making my kids cry. I want to smack one of these poor old sons in here with a bat.
December 23, 2024, President Joe Biden commuted the death sentences of 37 federal inmates. Among them was Kaboni Savage, a Philadelphia drug lord once condemned to die for one of the most horrific crimes the city had ever seen. Instead of execution, he will now spend the rest of his life behind bars. Savage's story isn't just about drugs. It's about fear, intimidation, and violence so extreme that even one of his own co-defendants told detectives he knew what they had done was beyond forgiveness, that they were crimes with no redemption. 1975, Savage was born and grew up in North Philadelphia. He once dreamed of being a boxer and even won his only professional fight, but those ambitions quickly gave way to the cocaine trade. By the late 1990s, Savage had built a powerful network, moving hundreds of kilos of cocaine through Philadelphia. But he wasn't just a trafficker. He ruled through fear, leaving a trail of bodies whenever anyone threatened his empire. Prosecutors linked him to at least a dozen murders. Rivals were gunned down, witnesses disappeared, and intimidation followed him even inside prison walls. But what made him most feared, though, was the attack he ordered in October 2004. From inside his cell at the Federal Detention Center in Philadelphia, Savage arranged for the firebombing of a row house belonging to the family of a federal witness. The fire killed 6 people. 4 of them were minors. It was the deadliest mass murder in Philadelphia since the year 2000, and Savage showed no remorse. In fact, when he learned the witness had been released from prison to attend his family's funeral, a wiretap caught Savage mocking the tragedy, saying they should pour barbecue sauce on them burnt bitches. 2013, a federal jury finally convicted Savage of 12 murders in aid of racketeering and sentenced him to death. It was the first federal death penalty case in modern Philadelphia history. But even from prison, Savage's reach was long. After all, his sister had helped him organize the firebombing from inside his cell. Hitmen carried out his orders, and allies kept the drug pipeline running for years, even after his sentencing. His name alone continued to carry weight in Philadelphia's underworld for so long. But now, Savage is housed at ADX Florence in Colorado and totally cut off from the outside world. And with his death sentence commuted, he will live out his days in a concrete cell, a far cry from the streets he once controlled with terror. Yet, for the families of his victims, this doesn't ease their pain. As one relative said after Biden's decision,
"They were children. They would have been adults now, but they don't have a voice. They were killed innocently."
One teenager don't like the other teenager because the way he wears his hat, because his ideology is different from his. A disciple don't like a vice lord.
December 1997, a federal courtroom in Chicago went silent as the verdict was read. Larry Hoover, known as King Larry, already serving a 200-year sentence for a 1973 murder, was found guilty on 40 more counts, including conspiracy, extortion, money laundering, and running a criminal empire from behind prison walls. And just like that, the judge gave him 6 additional life sentences. But here's the thing. For Hoover, prison was never a cage. It was a command center. 1950, born in Mississippi and raised in Chicago, Hoover joined the streets from an early age. By 12, he was already in a gang called the Supreme Gangsters. By 15, he had a reputation as a natural leader. And in the late 60s, when rival groups were merged, he helped form what became the Gangster Disciples, a gang that would dominate Chicago's South Side and eventually spread to dozens of states. At first, Hoover's rise looked like every other gang story: petty theft, violence, then drugs. But what set him apart was strategy. He turned the Gangster Disciples into an organized machine, with ranks, codes, and discipline. By the early 1970s, the gang was pulling in thousands of dollars a day from drugs. But power also meant blood. In 1973, Hoover ordered the killing of a drug dealer named William Pookie Young, and that landed him a 150 to 200-year sentence in Illinois State Prison. That should have been the end of him. Instead, it was only the beginning. At Stateville Correctional Center, Hoover reinvented himself. Guards noticed fewer fights, less chaos. and they even credited Hoover for his role in calming the prison. It looked like he was spending his time preaching education, discipline, and even community service. And just like that, he rebranded the gang as Growth and Development, telling followers to get diplomas, start businesses, and run voter registration drives. From the outside, it looked like a real and honest transformation. He was even transferred to a lower security prison and granted privileges like private meetings, nicer clothes, and better food. But behind that image of model inmate was a different reality. Federal investigators spent 17 years wiretapping phones, following money, and flipping witnesses against him. In the end, what they found was overwhelming. From his prison cell, Hoover was directing a 30,000-member organization across multiple states, bringing in more than $100 million a year in drug money. Even the nonprofits and businesses tied to growth and development were fronts for laundering cartel-sized profits. The investigation, known as Operation Headache, reached its peak in 1995 when 250 federal, state, and local officers raided dozens of gangster disciple hideouts and safe houses. Hoover was then indicted on conspiracy, extortion, and money laundering. 2 years later, he was convicted, sentenced to 6 life terms, and sent to ADX Florence. From then on, solitary confinement was his only reality. Yet Hoover's name never disappeared. In Chicago, some still saw him as a leader who wanted peace in the neighborhoods. In hip-hop, his story became legend, referenced in songs and shouted out in interviews. Rappers like Kanye West and Drake even held a Free Larry Hoover concert in 2021, calling for his release. You see, to his supporters, King Larry was more than a gangster. He was a symbol of power, transformation, and injustice. To authorities, though, he remained one of the most notorious criminals in Illinois history. May 2025, Donald Trump finally commuted Hoover's federal sentences to time served. It was a symbolic win for his supporters, but it didn't set him free. Remember that conviction in 1973? Well, because of it, Hoover still faces his original 150 to 200-year state sentence for murder. Illinois law means he can apply for parole because the crime happened before the state entirely abolished discretionary parole in 1978. But whether he'll ever walk out is still uncertain. But whether he dies in prison or one day sees parole, one thing is clear. Larry Hoover built an empire so strong that even decades of solitary confinement couldn't erase his name.